Welcome to Intel Focus, the review series. Today, March 27th, we're going to do a deep dive into something really significant happening in Europe right now, a surge in defense spending. It wasn't that long ago that talk was all about cutting budgets.
Right.
Peace seemed to be the norm, but now, well, things have changed. Europe is rapidly rearming, and our mission today is to figure out why this is happening,
Yeah.
what it means for the continent's future, and its role, on the global stage.
Absolutely.
We'll be using some recent analysis to really get a clear picture of this whole transformation.
It is a big change, isn't it?
It is.
To go from a time when, well, defense maybe wasn't a top priority for many European nations to this kind of urgent buildup of military budgets.
Yeah.
It really tells you something about how the security landscape has shifted.
For sure, and I think at the heart of it, there's this undeniable trigger. Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine.
Right.
February 2022. It's like that one event changed the whole security equation for the entire continent.
It did. I mean, you have the generation in Europe that grew up assuming peace was just the natural state of things.
Right.
Then you have the brutality of that invasion, the images of tanks crossing borders, missiles hitting cities.
Yeah.
It was a huge shock. It forced everyone to rethink what security actually means in the 21st century.
And we saw that immediate dramatic reaction from Germany.
Yeah.
Chancellor Schulz announcing that Zeitenwende, that turning point. 100 billion euros pledged for the Bundeswehr. It wasn't just about the money. It was a symbolic break from, decades of post-war defense policy.
Was.
What do you think that shift really means in the long term?
Well, what's interesting about the Zeitenwende is it shows how Germany is rethinking its whole role in European security. For a country that's historically been cautious about military power, this is a sign that they realize they need to be a stronger, more assertive force for stability in Europe.
Right.
It's a mental shift as much as a strategic one.
And then you have Poland aiming to spend over 4% of its GDP on defense, double NATO's target of 2%.
Wow.
They're buying advanced U.S. military equipment really fast, which shows they're serious about becoming a major military power in the region.
Yeah.
What's driving that commitment, do you think?
Poland's perspective is shaped by where they are geographically and, of course, their history.
Right.
They see a real immediate threat, and building up their military, especially ground forces, is their direct response.
Exactly.
But think about it. This could change the power dynamics in Eastern Europe.
Yeah.
A much stronger Poland would have big geopolitical implications.
For sure. It suggests they're ready to be more assertive. And we're also seeing similar increases, maybe on a smaller scale, in the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania.
Yeah,
Being so close to Russia definitely makes them think hard about defense spending.
absolutely. For those Baltic countries, the fear that the conflict could expand or that NATO's response might not be enough is very real. Their increased spending, it shows an urgent need to strengthen their own defenses and contribute to the overall security of the alliance.
So the immediate threat from Russia is a huge factor. But we also have to look at the long-standing pressure from within NATO itself, especially about that 2% spending target.
Right, that's been a point of contention for years.
It has.
The idea of the 2% was always to make sure everyone in the alliance shared the burden. But for a lot of European members, it was more like an aspiration.
Yeah.
Then the U.S., especially under the previous administration, really started pushing, questioning whether Europe was truly committed to its own defense.
And that questioning, that uncertainty about the U.S. commitment, that must have played a role in changing how Europe thought about strategic reliance.
Oh, for sure. The possibility that the U.S. might not always be there to protect Europe, it made them realize they needed to take more responsibility for their own defense. It was a wake-up call to become less strategically dependent.
And now, after the invasion, that 2% target isn't really optional anymore. We're seeing over 10 NATO members on track to meet or exceed it by 2024, and others are promising to do the same.
Which makes the alliance as a whole much stronger. But it's not just about hitting that 2% number. There's a growing focus on spending the money wisely.
Right, right.
It's about quality, not just quantity, and how well different countries' forces can work together.
Exactly. There's a real push for smarter spending. How can we make different national forces operate better together?
Yes.
Can we do joint procurement to get more for our money and reduce the kind of fragmentation we've seen in the past? Ultimately, it's about being more ready, more prepared.
Absolutely.
And those problems with aging equipment, well, they really highlighted how urgent this is.
Yeah, the conflict in Ukraine has been a harsh lesson about what modern warfare demands. It's shown some of the weaknesses in European military capabilities.
Right.
And this has definitely sped up the push for more effective and strategically aligned spending. And then, of course, there's the question of how Europe is going to actually produce all this equipment.
Right.
It's like a revival of the European defense industry.
Yeah, it's interesting how these increased budgets are breathing new life into a sector that's been, in many ways, neglected for decades.
Good head.
The scale of the conflict in Ukraine, it's shown just how much demand there is for things like artillery shells, drones, advanced missile systems.
Yeah, I think the amount of equipment used up in a high-intensity conflict like this was maybe underestimated.
Hmm.
This surge in demand, it's a big opportunity for European manufacturers to increase production, innovate, and fill those gaps.
Mhm.
But it's also a necessity.
And the EU is actively trying to encourage this with things like the European Defense Fund and by pushing for more joint procurement projects.
Hmm.
The goal seems pretty clear: to build up Europe's own industrial base and be less reliant on defense suppliers from outside the continent.
Those EU-level efforts are crucial for getting the European defense sector to work together better and standardize more.
Yeah.
Projects like that Future Combat Air System, the Franco-German Spanish fighter jet and the European Sky Shield Initiative, those are concrete examples of this push towards collaboration.
So the European Sky Shield Initiative, just quickly, it aims to create a shared air defense system for Europe so they can be more coordinated and effective against threats from the air.
Exactly.
But it's not a smooth process, is it? The European defense industry is still pretty fragmented. You have
Yeah.
all these national champions often competing with each other instead of really integrating.
It's true.
And there are different strategic visions at play. Some countries want close ties with the U.S. and prefer American-made systems.
Yeah.
Others, like France, they're pushing for greater European strategic autonomy. How do you see that playing out in the long run?
That tension between wanting to be strategically independent and wanting close alignment with the U.S., especially in Eastern Europe, it's a major challenge.
Yeah.
Figuring out how to manage those different priorities and getting past national industrial interests, that's going to be essential if they want a truly strong and integrated European defense industry.
Absolutely. And we need to broaden our understanding of defense because it's not just about conventional military power anymore.
Right.
We're seeing a lot more focus and investment in areas like cyber threats and hybrid warfare. It's a much more complex picture now.
It is. The whole idea of defense has changed. It includes a much wider range of threats now. Cyber attacks on critical infrastructure, disinformation campaigns aimed at disrupting democracies, sabotage against key facilities, even using energy supplies as a weapon.
And what Russia has done both before and during the invasion of Ukraine, it's really shown how effective and dangerous these tactics can be.
Right.
They've used cyber operations and disinformation as key parts of their overall strategy.
They have, and that's led to a necessary response from European governments.
Yeah.
We're seeing more money going into improving cyber defense, setting up special units to combat disinformation, and making critical infrastructure more resilient, from power grids to communication networks.
And it's not just individual countries doing this. NATO itself has officially recognized cyberspace as a domain of operations, just like land, sea, and air.
It has.
And at the EU level, we're seeing investments in things like secure satellite communication systems and developing artificial intelligence for military use.
What's really important to note here is how interconnected everything is becoming, and how the lines between civilian and military infrastructure are blurring.
Right.
Our reliance on things like undersea internet cables, mobile networks, energy grids, it creates new vulnerabilities that have to be addressed from a defense perspective.
Which means defense spending now includes things like cyber training for government staff, better data security in both the public and private sectors, and building resilience against interference and manipulation from outside. But it's important to remember that all these decisions about defense spending, they happen in a political context, and public opinion matters a lot.
It does. Defense policy isn't made in a vacuum.
Right.
It's a political choice. And ultimately, it's influenced by how much the public supports it and how secure people feel.
Yeah.
We saw a huge wave of solidarity with Ukraine across Europe after the invasion, along with a much greater awareness of potential threats.
We did. But as this conflict drags on and as economic pressures like inflation and the cost of living get worse, there's a chance that public support for increased defense spending could weaken.
Right.
Governments have a tough job balancing these defense needs with other important things like social programs and managing national debt.
They do. If they want to keep public support, they need to give a clear, convincing reason for these big spending increases.
Hmm.
It can't just be about reacting to immediate threats. It has to be about investing in long-term peace and security and Europe's role in the world.
So, looking at the big picture, what do you think are the main implications of this surge in European defense spending? What does it mean for the continent as a whole?
In a lot of ways, I think it shows a fundamental change in how Europe thinks about strategy and even its own identity.
Hmm.
The continent is being forced to face its vulnerabilities and take a more assertive, proactive stance in a world that's clearly more dangerous and unpredictable. We're seeing a move away from that reliance on soft power and a return to, well, you could call it the hard edge of geopolitics.
It definitely feels like a break from that post-Cold War era,
It does.
when there was this sense of lasting peace, maybe a bit naive in hindsight.
Maybe.
But like you said earlier, there are some big questions that still need answers.
There are.
And our listeners, these are things for them to think about too.
Exactly. Can European countries really overcome their habit of doing things separately when it comes to defense, to procurement, to their overall security policies? Can they create a more unified approach, one that's actually more effective? Will these big increases in military budgets mean cuts in other important areas, like development aid or climate change commitments?
Yeah.
And maybe the biggest question, how long can this current momentum last? What happens if political priorities change, or if the war in Ukraine tragically drags on with no clear end in sight?
Those are the really crucial questions that will shape Europe's future. But one thing seems certain. The days of Europe being complacent about defense are over.
They are.
The real impact of this rearming won't just be about how much money is spent, but about how wisely and strategically those resources are used.
At the end of the day, what we're seeing is Europe sending a clear signal about its approach to security. It's not willing to just assume that everything will be peaceful. This renewed focus on military strength, it's clearly a response to current threats, but it has profound implications for Europe's future and its place in the world.
Absolutely. Europe's increased defense spending is a complex and significant reaction to a security landscape that's changed dramatically. Russia's war in Ukraine is the main trigger, but it's also being shaped by changes within NATO and the evolving nature of warfare itself.
Right. It's not just about conventional threats anymore, but also the growing challenges of cyber and hybrid warfare.
Exactly.
And thinking about Europe's history, all its ups and downs, this renewed focus on military strength, it makes you wonder, how will this change not only its relationships with other countries, but also its own internal politics in the long run?
Yeah.
This isn't just about budgets. It's about what kind of Europe is emerging from all of this.
It is.
A very different Europe, I think.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Intel Focus, the review series. Until next time.
Goodbye.